So tonight, we're taking a totally different turn in our topics of discussion. We're going to kind of walk away for just a little bit from some history topics. We've been talking history now for the last couple of years. In 2025, the Cultural Center is focusing on lifeways. So Kim has requested that we talk about some lifeways, which oddly enough circles back to almost 3 years ago when we started reading the Wampum. Some of the basic topics that we talked about way back then were lifeways. So we're going to revisit some of those over the next several months. Actually, there's enough topics that we can finish out the rest of this year and step into 2026 with some lifeways. There's a few that we did not talk about 3 years ago. One was the clothing and regalia. We briefly mentioned some things relevant to clothing and some regalia and a couple of other topics, but we didn't go directly into clothing. So tonight we're going to start off the lifeways with clothing and regalia. And as I always do, I like to start off with a quote. And this is from Charles Aubrey Bucer, who back in the 1980s and 1990s was the unofficial historian for the Wyandotte Nation. Charles was an amateur historian that spent a lot of time researching and writing about the tribe, our history and traditions. He's got a lot of material out there, but the one thing that we have to be careful with Mr. Bucer's work is he really didn't annotate anything that he wrote. He wrote and he wrote and he wrote, but you have no idea where he got his material. So I used some of his stuff, but I used more of his own personal opinions and things that is not based upon the need for any type of annotation. And this is a really nice quote that Mr. Bucer had that ties directly into what we're talking about tonight, because back in the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of questions about clothing. And Mr. Bucer said, it is necessary to freeze your subject in time because the clothing changed quite rapidly after the mid-18th century. Even so, the costume varied with the season and changed from the ceremonial to the day-to-day dress and had to be adjusted for the hunt or the warpath. So that sums up really quickly and really nicely some of the complexities that has to do when we start talking about clothing. The problem is he just kind of scratched the surface on the complexities. When we start looking at things, there are a lot more things that factor into what he just mentioned. So the easiest thing for us to do is to just go out there and do a quick Google search. If we pull up a browser and we type in anything to do with what did a Wyandotte Indian look like, or as Jenny was doing this afternoon, she typed in Wyandotte Indian dress code, whatever that may be, and it brought up this wonderful explanation. Artificial intelligence put this together, and it really nicely tells what a Wyandotte Indian would have looked like. The Wyandotte people traditionally wore beaver skin mantles, leggings, and shoes in the winter. I hope they wore something. They also wore bead necklaces and bracelets and streaked their faces with red and black paint. Wow, that's pretty stinking good. So nowadays we have to be incredibly careful when we start doing anything with Google, because you just don't know what it's going to bring up. And especially since AI is really being used predominantly out there now in search engines. It's just taking this knowledge, whatever you want to call it, if you want to say it's knowledge, and formulating some piece of whatever, like what we see there on this Wyandotte Indian dress code. It basically tells us nothing. So when you also are looking for pictures, you can come up with these type of photos relevant to our clothing. On the left there is Bill Moose, which all of us should be very familiar with Bill Moose, or most of us should be. Mr. Moose is a legend in Ohio. He is thought to be the last living full-blood Wyandotte that walked upon the face of the earth. He died in 1937, which history tells us that the last full-blood Wyandotte died back around 1828. So Mr. Moose made himself a legend, and he became very famous because of the way that he started presenting himself. The costume that he's wearing there is the regalia that he wore when he performed with the Sells Brothers Circus. Problem is we don't even know if he's a Wyandotte or not. But when you Google something that has anything to do with what a Wyandotte looked like, boom, Mr. Moose pops up. Another very common image that pops up when you ask the question, what did a Wyandotte warrior look like, is the one there in the middle. For a lot of people, that is a Wyandotte warrior. But actually, when you research that out, like I did, that is not a Wyandotte warrior. That is a Sioux warrior by the name of Kills II. And that photo was taken of him somewhere around 1880. But if you look for a Wyandotte warrior, that's what commonly comes up. Another very common photo that pops up, and there's several different variations, is the men there on the right. They're Huron Wyandotte. That was taken also around 1880. And that shows a nice regalia that a lot of people have assumed is what we look like, because when you do the search, it comes up as Huron Wyandotte, not Wyandotte. So when you start looking out there, there's a lot of images that pop up that has nothing at all whatsoever, in no way, no how to do with us. So we got to be very careful. So when we start talking clothing, what can we look at? What did we look like? And what did a Wyandotte look like is one of the most commonly asked questions there is. A lot of people are interested. A lot of people want to look like the grandmas and the grandpas until they find out what the grandmas and grandpas actually look like. And one of the most difficult questions to answer is, what did a Wyandotte look like? It's synonymous. It's frequent, but it's difficult, because when we start talking about clothing or regalia, we have to factor into that a lot of different things, such as clan, gender, age, status of the individual, because we had different people within the tribe that held different levels of status. There were also different roles that they played. Some were chiefs, some were council, some were lesser chiefs, leading women, leading men. Depending upon what role they played within the tribe, they also had different styles and types of clothing. Location was big. Where you lived also played a different part on how you looked, as did the time and the era in which you lived. Of course, the seasons were also huge. What a citizen would have worn in the middle of summer was totally different than what they wore in the middle of winter. And activities, what were they doing? Were they just living day by day by day, a common citizen, fulfilling their tasks and their duties according to their clan law? Were they actually participating in war? Were they communicating with the English, the French, the Europeans? What were they doing also determined how they looked. And their interactions with the Europeans also greatly affected the way that they dressed. So it is literally impossible to say that a Huron Wyandotte looked a particular way. There were many ways that our grandmas and grandpas looked. And when Mr. Buser made the comment, we have to freeze our subject in time, that's kind of an understatement. It's not only time, but so many other factors that we have to take a look at. After the dispersal of 1651, the outward appearance of the people dramatically changed and frequently changed. Yeah, sure, there are common forms of clothing and attire that remain the same, that became, a cultural identity, cultural traits. And one of those that we're all familiar with is the black and buckskin. The black and buckskin is something that predominantly has never changed among the people. And when you look at a lot of the artifacts that was taken back to Canada with Barbeau, most of our citizens were making their clothing out of black felt, black buckskin, black cloth of some form, and most of it has got red. And the tradition that has stayed for hundreds of years is black and buckskin, black and cloth of some form that is edged with red. And that is a very consistent common identifier of our people. The colors black and red were predominant. They were worn between the sexes, and back in the day was fairly quick identifier of our people. No less today, with exception given to identifying one's clan, personal preference dictated how almost everybody chose to look. Sure, the clan told them that they had to wear certain things, but for the most part, what they wanted to adorn themselves with, how they wanted to dress, what they wanted to look like was their personal choice. They could choose whatever. In addition to clothing, we've talked before, paint, marks, feathers, personal adornments provided necessary uniqueness, individuality, and also an important status regarding who they were within the tribe. Comfort and convenience also dictated what someone wore or chose not to wear. And time pressure from the Europeans caused some shame to come among the people. And through the shaming of the people, the European missionaries were able to persuade them to change their clothing attire. Also, the mixture of old traditions, along with shame and adopted traditions, brought a even greater diversity of clothing in the middle of the people. Some people chose to stay with old traditions and wore what they knew the grandmas and grandpas wore because, like a lot of people today, they want to be traditional. Back then, the same thing was true. They wanted to remain as traditional as possible. So you would see this mix of tradition and the adoption of new, more contemporary ideas on garments and how clothing should be worn. So you could walk into any village and see this great mix of what people looked like. In 1816, when John Stewart came among the Wyandotte people, they were still comfortable with nudity or partial nudity, and it was an accepted cultural standard. At that time, no one really cared what a young man wore or didn't wear. It was still his preference and choice. If he wanted to walk around in the birthday suit, nobody cared. By 1832, the people did care if the young man chose to walk around with nothing. By this time, the Methodists had made a powerful impact upon the people. And what the Catholics could not do, the Methodists were able to obtain. They were able to change the ideologies of the people and realize that clothing was very important. What a citizen would have worn dramatically changed over a 16-year period. A lot of the old traditions, like the black cloth with the red borders, was retained by the people, and it became for special purposes or ceremonial purposes, but they didn't necessarily wear it every day. And with a few exceptions, the common Wyandotte citizen looked a lot like his white neighbors that were living just beyond the border of the Grand Reserve. In 1825, when Judge Lieb came to the Grand Reserve to do his report for the Department of War, which the Indians were not under the Department of the Interior as they are today. Back then, they were under the Department of War, and John Lieb wrote this as one little sentence out of his pretty decent, really elaborate, very heartfelt plea for the government to not remove us from Ohio and Michigan. He said they mostly dress like their white neighbors and seem as contented and happy as any other portion of people I ever saw. He went on to say that if you walked into the Grand Reserve, if you didn't see the face of the people, paraphrasing a little bit of what he was insinuating, if you walked into the Grand Reserve and you didn't see the face of the people to realize and recognize them as Indians, you would have never dreamed or guessed that the people that you were observing were Indians. They looked like the whites, they acted like the whites, they lived like the whites. And he goes on to say that they were every bit as good as the whites that lived around them. And a lot of that was due to the fact that they did not look like the type of regalia, the type of clothing that most people assume the Indians wore. So when you look back at this time frame, what did the people look like? What did the Europeans look like? The Americans look like, that we were adopting and beginning to look just like them? And Martin Welker wrote this wonderful little paper that goes back to the 1840s, 1830s, 1850s, in that time area. and he describes what the Europeans, the Americans were looking like, what they did, how they lived. And he said this of the women and the girls. And if you can picture this, this is to a degree what our citizens were looking like just prior to removal from Ohio. The women and the girls for everyday wear in the wintertime wore flannel dresses, plain, striped, or cross-barred, as fancy might dictate, with quilted or red flannel petticoats. In the summer, they generally wore gingham, calico, and lawn for dresses, with dimity skirts and sunbonnets when out of doors. Most of the women and girls had an extra suit or two for dress occasions of alpaca, merino, and other fine goods, with fashionable bonnets, shawls, and wraps of various kinds. The corset was then unknown among the girls. Parasols and umbrellas were not very plenty in the family. Powders and cosmetics were not then used with decoration by the women. But we know that our women were using paint, and we're still using paint all the way up until the early 19th century. So if you can picture that, that is to a degree what our women were beginning to look like. They began to change their attire, their appearance in whole. And at the same time, this is what the men looked like. The common dress of the boys consisted of linsey pants and wamas, whatever that is, or roundabout, but no drawers or undershirts nor overcoats. Basically, the drawers is underwear. There was no underwear. With coarse shoes and wool hats or hair seal caps for the winter, and linen and toe cloth and straw hats for the summer. Men often wore the same, but generally had coats and pants made out of full flannel, and some were able to wear store clothes made by the village tailor. Plaid cloaks as well as overcoats were worn by the men in winter. Buttons for shirts were made of flax thread spun at home, and wooden molds covered their hand with some cloth materials, answered for buttons on heavy clothing. So that is a fairly good description of what our men were beginning to look like as well. And here in a bit, we'll look at some photos from around that general time, and we'll see that that does match up well. So hang a woolen or linsey suit upon a Wyandotte, and what do you have? A Wyandotte draped with a woolen or linsey suit. In 1843, when the Huron-Wyandotte people were removed from Michigan and Ohio, the U.S. government could have cared less about what the people looked or what they wore. The politicians knew and were deeply concerned that a Huron-Wyandotte warrior and mother from the old days still lived inside. So it doesn't matter how our people changed on the outside. It doesn't matter what they wore or began to adopt from the Americans. If they began to dress up in their Sunday best, or they put on their linsey suits and went to town, whatever it was that they did, however it was that they looked, it did not hide the fact that they were still a Wyandotte. You can change the outward appearance, but you cannot change what's inside. And that is what terrified the U.S. government. And that is what allowed us to succeed and grow and expand when we moved out to the West, when nothing was there for us. So let's take a few looks at some photos of what our citizens looked like back in that time frame. This is a photo of Isaac Brown and his wife, and that was taken after the move from Ohio to Kansas, and he looks pretty dignified. She is still wanting to wear some things that is identifying her with her traditions. So she's got that belt around her neck. Actually, it's coming down from her hat. So she is still trying to retain as many things as she can, included to her wardrobe. I really like this picture of John Solomon. That right there in my vision of who we were, who we are, what we will be, Wyandotte people, boom, John Solomon's the man. It says down there on the caption of his photo, John Solomon, big Wyandotte Indian. Wow, to have met somebody like John would have been phenomenal. And we have men today that look like that as well. But that is a classic photo of a Wyandotte. And you can see John Solomon's just got a nice jacket, shirt, and kind of a little tie, little kerchief around his neck. Of course, we all know Mother Solomon. They were married. He died young. She lived to be a legend in Ohio, and she is today a legend among our people. And she dressed up really nice with the lace for that photo that she took there. This is another favorite photo of mine. I absolutely love that picture of Maggie Kuhn with the horse. That just shows so much personality. It shows what our women, probably most of them, were looking like in 1911, 1912, in that area when Barbeau came to Oklahoma. And you can see that there's very little there that would identify her anything other than the other whites that had basically walked into the reservation and started taking over the land. That picture there on the left shows one of her hand beaded purses, which those are phenomenal. So she was still keeping the tradition, but she was beginning to look no different than the other whites on the reservation. Same here with Irvin Patton Long. This is a formal photo taken of him, most likely when he was serving as chief, but he dressed up real nice as well. Looks very dignified, very chiefly in that photo. Same thing here, initially with Nicholas Cotter. The photo there on the bottom left was taken when he and Matthew Muddeater went to Washington, D.C. At the time that the photos were taken, other photos are made of other chiefs from other nations. Many of those chiefs are wearing their bonnets and their feathers and their regalia that is just so classic today of what we would see like in the powwow arena. But when our men, Matthew and Nicholas, got their photo taken, they were in a linsey suit or a woolen suit. Interesting photo of him when he was a younger man. And we can see how time changes us. That's Nicholas there on the right with Elizabeth and one of their grandchildren. He became an older man. Mary Kelly, Kate Armstrong, also from the Barbeau archives. I put this photo in there because I'm really curious what Mary is wearing. It looks like she's got this full-length cape, this robe of some sort that is covering her dress. Are any of the women familiar with what that might be? If so, speak up, let us know what it is, because I find that fascinating, whatever it is that she's wearing. Does anybody know what Mary has on? She's the one that's there on the left-hand side. If not, we can come back and maybe talk about that later, but whatever that is that she's wearing, it looks very elegant. And the last photo, also taken at the era of Barbeau, 1911, 1912. And this is John Scrimpshire, Smith Nichols, and John Caraho. Last month, we talked about John. John was the chief that was incompetent. He spoke only Wyandotte, got into some little troubles that was not of his making. And he ended up moving south of Lost Creek and began to live as a traditionalist. Spent most of his time with the Seneca Cayuga. And of course, Smith Nichols, a lot of us are familiar with him. So these are Wyandotte traditionalists. These are the men who continue to try and live as the ancestors did. But look what they're wearing. 1911, 1912, the era in which this photo, the time in which this photo was taken. They walk into Miami. It would have been hard for them to have looked any different from the other men that were walking the streets, other than the look on their faces and the words that they were speaking. So even the traditionalists in 1911, 1912, and these men were hardened traditionalists, still looked a lot like the whites that were living around them. So that is what the men, the women began to look like shortly after the Methodists came into Ohio. In 1816, John Stewart walked in. But what did our grandmas and grandpas, what did the ancestors look like prior to these radical changes that took place over just a short amount of time when Methodism and the people began to convert to Christianity? What did they look like? So before we take a look at that, a little cautionary disclaimer. The following slides discuss the wearing of clothing in the old days. The wearing of clothing or not prior to John Stewart did not have yet many strong influences from the European missionaries. The Catholics were heavily among our people all the way from the dispersal up until this time frame. They spent more time around the Detroit area, so there's a great influence of the Catholics still at play in Detroit. But even the Catholic missionaries who frowned upon nudity or partial nudity did not have any convincing arguments for our people to change. And here in a little bit, we will see a quote from Conderonk. Conderonk, during his conversation with Baron de Lahothen, made a comment defending why there had to be nudity among the tribe, because he was questioned about that in his discussion with the Baron. And if you haven't read that, it's an amazing talk. In the conversation, Conderonk is not mentioned as Conderonk, he's Ardario. So we'll see what Conderonk says about nudity among the tribe here in a little bit and why it was there. There are many small references that are made to the wearing of clothing or not by several other different observers. They make little mentions here and there of the clothing, but they don't go into a lot of detail. The greatest details that we have given to the wearing of clothing was recorded in 1822 by two men. Reverend Charles Eliot came to the Grand Reserve while Reverend Finley had to leave because of some health reasons. So Reverend Eliot, he made his observations, wrote them down, and later wrote Indian Missionary Reminiscences, which is a phenomenal book. It takes a different perspective than what Reverend Finley does, but in his book, Reverend Eliot gives a nice series of descriptions of what the people wore, and same did Charles Trowbridge. Trowbridge was working for the governor in Michigan. He was tasked with contacting all the different nations in the area around Detroit, and he made also some really good observations on what the people wore way back when. So let's take a look at what that was. In the old days, the young girls didn't wear any clothing until they were 6 years of age. This tradition, as recorded by Mr. Trowbridge, was retained all the way up until the early 19th century. So the young ladies didn't wear any clothing unless it was necessary because of certain times of the year when it was too cold or otherwise they had to put on clothes for survival. The young girls didn't cover themselves. The girls and the women were often held to a higher standard than the boys. At times, the women possessed a higher degree of modesty than the men. The wearing of clothing or not for the young girls and the boys was done for a reason. And after the age of 6 years, the young women began to wear a wrap, also known as a frock, when it was convenient to cover their private areas. The wearing of a wrap continued throughout the life of the woman. She would always wear a wrap. We'll read a description of what that wrap looked like here in a bit, but that wrap was something that was always with her. It was common for the woman to leave her breast uncovered. At times, the woman did wear a frock to cover her breast for specific reasons, but for the most part during the day, she went topless. The women were expected to tend the fields and employed themselves with hard labor. When working, the women wore leggings, no differently than the men would, and they better cover themselves so that they would not harm or cut themselves. If you can imagine working a garden with a lot of corn, most of us have had corn, and if you're working with the corn, you reach in there, those corn leaves can be almost like razor blades. So the women had to cover themselves because of the type of work that they did, and they wore extra covering so that they wouldn't cut themselves up badly. When exerting themselves, clothing for both the men and the women was an inconvenience. It was optional and frequently discarded. Nudity and partial nudity in the old days was conveniently common inside and outside of the longhouse and the lodge. There were no undergarments whatsoever that were worn by the men or the women. A quick little description of the women. The females wear moccasins and leggings in common with the boys. They wear what is generally called a shroud or wrapper in English. It is about 1 yard long and is nothing more than a piece of plain cloth without any other markings than 2 straps on the upper side, which are fastened to a belt tied round the body a little under the breast, and which keeps the shroud from falling down. It is thus suspended. After being wrapped around the lower part of the body, and overlapped about 1 foot. It goes down almost as far as the ankle and ascends as high as to reach above the loins, so that when it is tied to the belt, the weight of the cloth makes the belt rest upon the haunches, by which the belt is preserved from falling down. So Reverend Elliott gives a nice little bit kind of description of what the woman wore and what she would have looked like. And this is common throughout the tribe. He continued by saying they wear a sort of frock, a loose gown or bedgown with a long waist, which reaches down as far as the middle of the leg. Sometimes they wear a handkerchief on their heads, but mostly nothing at all. Their hair is generally plaited or braided, and long plaits dangle on their backs and shoulders. The women sit up, and here he's talking women, but he's not talking about our women. Reverend Elliott is making reference to the women that were working in the mission church, in the mission school, and what they were doing to help our children. The women sit up usually until 10, 11, and sometimes to 12 o'clock at night, and even later, in order to furnish clothing for our half-naked children as they came in rags, to clean and comb them so as to rid them of vermin. Was a most loathsome and difficult undertaking, as they greased their heads with bear oil and never combed them. To comb their hair was an unpleasant yet necessary work. The cincture, too, which they wore around their loins for the purpose of tying their legging strings to it, was a fruitful reservoir of living creatures. So that's kind of gross, but it goes to show to what degree some of the clothing was within our children. The children were, for the most part, still wearing very little to nothing. When you start talking about the leggings that the little boys were wearing leggings, but they didn't wear a loincloth or anything with them. So all they had was something to protect their legs. Continuing, the children were very poorly clothed in general when they came. They wore moccasins in the place of shoes, both males and females. The boys have leggings instead of overalls, which go down as far as their ankles or upper part of their foot and reach up as high as mid-thigh. These were kept up by 2 straps fastened to a cincture, which surrounded the loins. Pretty good description. In the old days, the boys and young men did not wear any clothing until they were 20 years of age. A little bit different than the girls. The girls were 6 years of age before they started wearing clothing. The boys didn't wear clothing until they were 20 years old. And there's a reason for that, as given by Kondarok. And it's different. Of course, like with the girls, there were times of the year when clothing was an absolute necessity for survival. Winter, we'll see a little bit later, the big heavy robes came into play. Both the men and the women were hardier and more tolerant to changes in the weather than people are today. So the lack of clothing was a lot more tolerated back then than what most people could even begin to dream of today. They basically lived in the elements. They became a part of the element, and the elements did not affect them to the great degree that we see that today among our generation. After 20 years of age, a loincloth was worn by the young and older men. In time, the men also choose to wear a kilt as an option to the loincloth. And the detail of where the kilt came from isn't really fully explained, but it makes me wonder if when the Scots came over, our people saw the kilts being worn by the Scotsmen, because when you start looking, we had several Scots that were adopted into the tribe, and it could be that they adopted that from the men as they were brought into the tribe from Scotland. Leggings on both the boys and the men were common. The boys without a loincloth. If by chance a man made a leisurely stroll through the village in his birthday suit, he would not have received shame or condemnation. So anytime after 20 years old, if a man was strolling down the middle of the village with nothing on, people were just like, okay, but gross, okay. However, the man would have likely received some harsh teasing, and some sharp whistles, which was a kind of a sign of rebuke. So he would not be shamed or receive condemnation, but he would have been pretty well brought to his attention that that was not really appropriate or expected, but it was tolerated still. In the old days, the men often shaved their hair to a scalp lock. Sometimes they wore a mohawk. Sometimes they shaved their head completely bald, and they did that for a reason. They did that because of the lice. The men shaved their head to just a small patch on the scalp lock, the mohawk. The women did not shave their hair, as we've already seen, but the men shaved their hair for that purpose. Plus, two, it also gave less of a handhold for a warrior to grab hold of something and kind of get control of the man, because in hand-to-hand combat, who controls the head controls the man. So the men shaved their hair. By the early 19th century, the men had stopped shaving their heads. In the old days, hair anywhere on the body for both the men and the women was removed. Our grandmas and grandpas did not tolerate any hair. A lot of that is because of the little vermin that could have easily infested it, but our people did not like hair on their bodies. The men often wore a folded handkerchief on their head like a bandana. And in time, the men came to wear a turban-like wrapping. So this is something that is traditional, and it goes to show that feathers at any time in history, which we talked about this a couple of years ago, they were not commonly or frequently worn by the men outside of a symbol of status or ceremony. So our men wore a bandana type turban. During wintertime, heavy robes were worn by all ages and genders. Robes were frequently made from the hides of bear or buffalo. The hides of the black fox were also a favorite. And if you notice, there's a common theme of color, black and red, black and red. In time, the heavy robes were replaced with woolen jackets. The men frequently wore a capote. A capote is basically a heavy, often woolen blanket with a hood. That is common that the men began to wear in the late 18th century. Moccasins, the pinch toe, was worn by all ages and genders. In time, the moccasins were replaced with European-made shoes and boots, and the moccasins, along with other garments, were often heavily decorated, as we began to see and use here lately. In addition to the beads, the porcupine quills heavily adorned the moccasins and other garments. It's nice to see that the quills are coming back. Reverend Elliott went on to say their shirts were not concealed as ours, talking more about the men here. Their shirts, the men's shirts, were not concealed as ours are, but hang down as far as their knees in fashion of the old sort of bedgowns. Their shirts are mostly ruffled in the most ludicrous manner, and generally with as coarse stuff as the shirts themselves, and of the same color, which varies in every hue. For some are white, some cotton, some muslin, and on and on. Besides, the ruffles are about as dirty as they can be. They generally wear jackets similar to ours, which are rarely kept buttoned. Over these is worn a hunting shirt, some of deerskin, as are sometimes the leggings also, but mostly of linsey and always well fringed off. So even though they were getting to adopt the clothing, the wardrobe of the Americans, well fringed off, they were still putting their signatures, they were still putting their own preferences on these clothing that they were getting to wear. They were still decorated. Some in the places of the hunting shirt wear surtouts, made for the most very well and generally a fine cloth. Around the waist and to complete the body dress is worn the belt, made of thick leather, about 3 inches broad, buckled tight with a strong buckle, and having the knife scabbard hung on it, which is made of a thick piece of leather, mostly made with tacks, riveted to the point end after passing through the two folds of the leather. Their headdress is a large handkerchief, folded like a neck handkerchief, but twice as broad, and tied around the upper part of the head so as to leave the lower half of the hair bare, and going about 2 inches above the crown of the head, and with it forming a sort of crater. Now, this is where we can find a reference as to why the nudity and partial nudity was accepted within the tribe. And it also explains why the men up till 20 years old didn't wear anything. And it's different. And this is from Kondorok. This is what he is giving in response to the question being asked of him by the Baron. Why did the people go without clothes? And this was his response back to the Baron. Now, these reasons have come no place among us, where everything must fit, whether great or little. For the young women taking a view of the naked parts makes their search by the eye. And for as such as nature has observed the measure of proportion in both sexes, any woman may be well assured that she has to expect from her husband. Our women are as fickle as yours. And for that reason, the most despicable man here never despairs of having a wife. For as everything appears naked and often to sight, so every girl chooses according to her fancy without regarding the measures of proportion. So that is Kondorok's reply as to why nudity among the tribe, especially the men up to 20 years old, was accepted. And read into that as you will, but that is from one of our greatest chiefs ever to walk the face of North America, Kondorok. So the Huron-Wyandotte people were known for extravagance. The people were known for costly clothing and regalia during times of ceremony. When the time came to give thanks to the Creator, a little expense was spared. Quill work, wampum, silver ornaments, and other ornamentations were often worn to near gaudiness. During times of war, the men dressed to fight. During times of ceremony or during council, the warriors often dressed to impress. So the people go from just everyday garments to, wow, just an absolute sight to behold. The slouchy appearance was the inspiration for an enemy warrior to think they could defeat a Huron-Wyandotte warrior. When a Huron-Wyandotte's hair looked fantastic, an enemy warrior could not resist and took pause for a brief moment to think, wow, that Wyandotte's hair sure looks nice. Within that momentary pause, his own hair was parted with a tomahawk. So even during war, our men were impressive in their appearance. They were designed, they were often described as the fiercest warriors of all the nations on North America. But when they went to war, they looked the part. They never gave any warrior a hope of a chance of looking and thinking, wow, that Wyandotte's just, he's just a dude. No, he was a fierce warrior, and we looked the part. We never gave anybody the chance to doubt who we were. Dion Quat and his party came one Sabbath to the council house, where we held our meetings, dressed up and painted in real savage Indian style, with their headbands filled with silver bobs, their headdress consisting of feathers and painted horsehair. The chief had a half moon of silver on his neck before, and several hangings on his back. He had nose jewels and earrings, and many bands of silver on his arms and legs. Around his ankles hung many buck hooves to rattle when he walked. His party was dressed in similar style. The likeness of animals were painted on their breasts and backs, and snakes on their arms. So when Dongquat basically came in and confronted Reverend Finley, he looked the part. He was intimidating. He was a Wyandotte warrior. He was the chief, and everything that he had was flash and pomp, and everything was just wow when he walked in. But he wouldn't have worn this to war. This was what he would have done during ceremony, and in this particular instance, he dressed up to intimidate, and the intimidation factor didn't really affect Finley, but it was just this impact of a man and everything that he had about him. This is what the Wyandottes did. We went to the nth degree. We went to a form of extravagance that no other nation could touch. They were considered the richest and most industrious Indians on the continent. Mr. McKee told Governor Simcoe that when he first became acquainted with these people, about 1750, they would frequently change their dresses 8 or 10 times in the course of an evening when holding one of their grand dances. and that each dress was so loaded with ornaments as to be valued at 40 to 50 pounds, which that 40 to 50 pounds, I calculated it out several years ago, and it is an extraordinary amount of money in today's dollars. If I can recall, it's tens of thousands of dollars when it works out with the pounds and then the cost of inflation and everything. But Mr. McKee was impressed how our people, during a grand dance, during a time of celebration, giving thanks to the Great Spirit, would change their dresses 8 to 10 times in the course of an evening. And it was loaded with all kinds of silver and quills and wampum, to the point that the value was extreme. When the Wyandotte Tribe's powwow was established in 1988, looking like a Wyandotte Indian at the powwow became very important. However, no one knew what that look was like. The traditional regalia of a birthday suit, wrap, or loincloth, and nothing more, was not in 1988, nor is it today openly embraced. So today, our women are making ribbon skirts. Our men are making ribbon shirts. As we have not seen in any of this, they don't appear to be something that our people wore back in the day, but it has become new tradition. The ribbon skirts and the shirts can be of any style, any color, anything that people want, and they become an expression of who they are and what they like. And that is a direct reference and reflection upon our grandmas and grandpas as they adorn themselves, with exception to what the clan told them they had to wear, but they could make themselves look like whatever they wanted. And our people are doing the same thing today, because when you see the ribbon skirts, you see the ribbon shirts, they are very, very colorful. They are very artistic. They display the personality of the person wearing them. And it's nice to see that. There's the sources as usual, and that's all. Any thoughts, questions, suggestions, or anything? That was, again, a lot of stuff. I hope everybody's still out there.
So Lloyd, the section where you were talking about where they were wearing the apparel with the bells and things like that, is that where some of our powwow attire has come from?
A lot of the different nations had several shared traditions. A lot of the bells, a lot of there was the mentioning of the deer hooves. A lot of that was back in the day worn for a purpose. When walking through the forest, it was believed that if you could have an awareness factor about yourself, our people wore a lot of the deer hooves before the little silver bells became, very frequently brought over by the Europeans. But a lot of those adornments were worn for a purpose. The clanging of the deer hooves was to ward off any evil spirit as you walk through the forest. So as those were used during daily use, they became more ceremonial. And as those type of wardrobes passed, they were adopted. So yes, those are there for a purpose. The bells, the deer hooves, if you look, some of the regalia probably still use deer hooves, other things other than the bells. They are a continuation of tradition from hundreds of years ago. And
but only the men wore those, right?
The women also wore some bells. The men predominantly wore them, but the women could also wear the bells as well.
I want to jump in on this because Trisha specifically asked for powwow. Just so that everybody knows, powwow is not traditional Wyandotte. I'm sure most of us know that now, but that's more of a contemporary tradition that was started about 35 years ago. So anything that's in the powwow arena is not traditional dress of Wyandotte people. Well, okay, I say that, but the Eastern Woodlands, the Woodlands style dress is the closest for us. So that's now what Caleb is wearing. He's dressed out as Woodlands. And the women, it's like a Woodland style. The jingle dress is not, it's Ojibwe, so it's not something that we should be wearing unless you specifically have permission from Ojibwe people to wear that, but it is an Ojibwe dress. Just so everyone knows, and this we're trying to put this out there more. Powwow should not be a time that we're dressing up. It's not a time to play dress up. It's a, for most people, this is, for a lot of people, especially in Oklahoma, it's more of a family get together that they go around and have, they go to powwows to have fun and all that. It's not a Renaissance thing, festival, or anything where you should dress up. The only time that you should dress up is if you're actually going out dressed out to dance, and that you're going to be dancing in those specific categories. Just we shouldn't be dressing out and I'll bring that back out a little bit. Ribbon skirts are okay because ribbon skirts have become a pan-Indian, meaning that across Indian country, it's a recognized thing, just a way to, how do I say that? A way to show that you are native. And so wearing that at any event is absolutely okay. But what you see out there, most of those things are not traditional for Wyandotte people. The woodlands, like what Caleb is, he's got the deer hooves, he's got different things around, he's got and there is a woodlands guy that dances, he wears the Nusquetra, well, he's Seneca Cayuga, so he calls it a Gastoa. It's just not very typical to see that out in the arena, if that makes sense.
I can remember when the first powwows were down at Sycamore Valley, and I put the comment in here, and this is from That Time Is Gone, about everything that was being discussed, because I can remember a lot of these discussions that were going back as far as 1988. People were very concerned about what they looked like because we were now having the powwow. All these nations were coming from around the country and they looked the part of the Indian, and the Wyandottes were walking in their blue jeans and t-shirt and nice shoes and boots, and they didn't look that part. A lot of people were concerned about that. A lot of discussions were made back then, and it came to the determination. That's why Mr. Buser wrote a lot of these work, was to answer these questions that were being asked back then. And it came down to the fact that when Wyandotte showed, just like what was happening at the Grand Reserve, when they began to adopt the attire of the Americans around them, it didn't matter what you wore. You had to be respectful, of course. You couldn't walk in there in, a holy t-shirt or a wife beater shirt or anything like that. You had to be respectful. But it came to the conclusion it didn't matter what we wore, because what was important was not on the outside, it was on the inside. Respect for what was happening in the arena was paramount. And we didn't have to dress to be an Indian, because guess what? We are. And if you have to walk around trying to dress up to be one, then maybe we should question why that is. So, Kim made a lot of good things clear. But when we go to the powwow, we go to honor the ancestors, not only of ours, but of all the other nations. And if we go wearing a Wyandotte Nation powwow t-shirt and blue jeans, that's okay, because it's what's on the inside that matters, not what we clothe ourselves on the outside with.
True. I will also say though, modesty is very big in Indian country, not just Wyandotte, but just Indian country across the continent. That they we put out there that we expect ribbon skirts to be past the knee, and that whenever you do make ribbon shirts, that they should not be like wife beaters, because we see other tribes that they're starting to just like put tank tops and throw some ribbons on it, and that's inappropriate. we're just trying to keep a standard that we're not, yeah, we don't want to have, so we do have different things like women wearing shawls when they're out in the arena. But that's also not just powwow, and we want to start focusing more on our social dances. Those are much more important than our powwows to our traditional way of life, because social dances go all the way back to our longhouse ways during before European contact. So the shawls to be worn during certain dances, not wearing shorts, not wearing sleeveless shirts. There's just certain things that we want to encourage people to stay at a certain standard so that we will be respected across Indian country.
Good stuff.
Kim, I have a question for Kim. This is Beezy.
Uh-huh.
What you mentioned, with the jingle dresses, and getting consent, from the Ojibwe. Now I'm not going to be wearing a jingle dress because I am, I'm an old woman. That's what I'm trying to say. But my question is, what if there's a young Wyandotte girl who wants to learn jingle dance and compete as a jingle dancer? Would she need to seek permission from the Ojibwe before she took that step?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah.
I'm going back to Trisha. She had put in there. Was it Bill Moose who he talked about that had worn bells and stuff? Every I don't know if that's who it was. Let me see. If that's who it was, no. No. Okay. But going back to what you see in the arena today is not influenced by Wyandotte culture at all, because powwow is still like what I said. Powwow is not influenced by Wyandottes. Wyandottes are influenced by powwow, if that makes sense.
Right.
That we're not taking on there's absolutely nothing in that arena that is influenced by Wyandottes, unfortunately, just because it's just the nature of what powwows are.
Yeah. The person that Trisha is referencing is Dionquat.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Dionquat is the successor to Chief Tarhe. And Dionquat was described by Reverend Finley as just being a brute of a man. So what he was doing there may or may not have necessarily been a reflection on what a lot of the Wyandotte men did at the time. Dionquat was very incompetent. He caused a lot of problems. He basically started a lot of fires within the nation, went and put out his own fires to make him look like he was pretty good at what he was doing as chief. But what he was doing there was done with the sole purpose of intimidating Reverend Finley, and that may have been a specific way in which several of the men dressed, but that was definitely his flamboyancy. He had to basically paint himself and dress himself up to make him look better than what he was. And that's a big.
Me too, Lloyd.
Yeah, we all. But that was Dionquat that I was referring to there, and that's a description given of him by Reverend Finley.
Okay. We host a powwow. It actually started in '88, like what Lloyd said. That was Chief Bearskin. He wanted to have the biggest and best of all of everything. If you knew Chief Bearskin, he wanted to be the best at everything. And that was why we started a powwow. But it is very typical nowadays that there are powwows from New York to California, that powwow was more a plains style tradition, and it's just something that's been adapted pan-Indian. So and at different times throughout the years, different dances have shown up that have been influenced. Like Ojibways would not have been traditional powwow people, but then they started going into there, and then that's when the jingle dress was introduced. And so there's just different time periods that different dances were introduced. So there might be a time where there is a Wyandotte dance specifically, but we can always hope. But right now we're focused on our social dances and our longhouse dances. Well,
Got to take care of ourselves first.
yeah, absolutely. And there is a dance, smoke dance, that the Haudenosaunee people dance, and it's amazing to watch. It wears me out just watching it. But so if you see those at powwows, that is like Iroquois people. So that I don't know when smoke dance, I don't know enough about it to know if it was before we left that area or after. I'm kind of assuming it was created after we left, like the New York area, that we probably didn't do it. But it's become a contemporary tradition of what we do. And it was a time period when not a lot was known about our tribe and who we were as a people, and we didn't know longhouse ways, and those ways got set aside for a time. And if you look back in the 70s and 80s, probably even earlier, a lot of the chiefs wore like these war bonnets to signify that they're chiefs. And that had absolutely nothing to do with our culture at all. It was just something to try to grasp at anything because we didn't know what our ways were.
Right.
Okay. Anybody got any more thoughts or comments? This is good stuff. I like it. Not one person has left since logging in at 8 o'clock. Well, I guess that's it, Kim.
All right, let me hit.
Tisha May Lloyd, thank you very much.
You're welcome.